born in the Soviet Union, came here when I was a 5-year-old kid. And so my parents, my dad was Jewish, my mother was not. They've both since passed. But they, I remember being 9, 10, 11 and hearing about, FBI agents following them around in the mid-70s when we first got here. And so these issues around that Dr. Peterson is raising around the totalitarian, let's say, phenomenon of the early and middle 20th century are not like abstract to me. They're not things I read about in history books. My grandfather on the Russian side was an infantry radio operator in World War II on the Russian front. So he made it through, I guess, almost 5 years of warfare from when the Germans broke the treaty and invaded Russia. And, and as I'm sure you know, the Eastern Europeans on that side really bore the brunt of the war in terms of numbers and, not just the Russians, the many, many other people that fought the Nazis. And really, in a sense, the historians would probably say they're really the ones that won, quote unquote, won the war in Europe. Like the D-Day invasion was, of course, important and decisive, but it was kind of like 700,000 people versus 20 million. The numbers kind of speak for themselves. So both in terms of Nazi Germany and Stalin, who are the two great sort of poles in Peterson's thinking around, the excesses of the totalitarian right versus the excesses of the totalitarian left. Those things are not abstract to me. They're not things I primarily read about in some academic situation. I did also do some of that in university, but it's my family history. It's quite literally my family history. And so, I remember my dad being excited when the Gulag Archipelago, the second version, came out in the 70s, that where there was a different, slightly different contents that was a little bit more explicitly pointing to the particulars of what was going on and this kind of stuff. And so that is a memory that I have in my family. So I'm very sympathetic to Dr. Peterson's sort of interest in those things, in from the very standpoint, and I come to the same conclusions in a sense. I have the same respect for Jung as a central sort of uniter of the exploratory Western kind of.
Before you get on to Jung, can I ask you a question about the Russian thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think that one of the biggest criticisms, you hear from about Peterson is that he's hyperbolic when he talks about, postmodern neo-Marxist stuff in the universities and the possibility of that happening again and all that sort of thing? Do you think that he's being hyperbolic, or do you think? No,
I don't actually. That's not, you'd think that I would, having, the history I have, but I don't. I actually am with him on that. So, somewhat to my own dismay. I'm a lifetime leftist in every sense, certainly in a global sense, but I'm a kind of Bernie Democrat, in terms of the role of government, and very European style, Canadian style social democrat, as far as self-identified. I know there's a distinction between, the Canadian sort of system and much of the rest of the Europe that's not the UK, but essentially, no, I'm not. I think that his critique of what's at stake in that conversation is actually spot on. And if anything, I would say in the American situation, as opposed to even Canada, I would say in the American situation, the cultural and therefore political volatility that could ensue if things get polarized and kind of the right sort of grounding kind of centripetal forces don't stay strong is actually quite spot on. I think he's actually probably among very few who certainly in terms of public intellectuals, but very few that understand what's at stake in those ideas and how they play out in people's real lives. I think he's spot on with that. I don't share that.
And what do you think about his idea of the sovereignty of the individual as being like the remedy?
Well, that's where I start to part company from him, because from that stand, that there's no way to summarize that very simply.
Because you're a Buddhist, and one of the main principles of Buddhism is no self. And I'm trying to think, okay, this concept of no self, anatman, and postmodernism. Is there a difference?
Well, yeah, but there's different. Okay, I have a response to that I've thought through pretty well, having been living this stuff for a couple of decades now. Not just Buddhism, but other alchemical traditions like Judaism, like Kabbalistic Judaism, mystical Judaism, which I have been connected to since late '97 in the Bay Area primarily, and I have friends that are leaders and thought leaders in that regard, all over the country and in other places. And so it's not for me a question of Buddhism and the notion of an Atman, but it's more the sociology. And I think Peterson would appreciate this distinction. This has to do with the sociology of spiritual traditions generally. Like it's not that everybody has to have this very refined view that a great mystic would have. Like Buddhism, Buddha Dharma is not primarily outside of, I would say, the tantric dimension, the Vajrayana, what the Himalayan traditions sort of specialize in, you could say, as a facet of the general Mahayana. Like I think of it as Mahayana Tantra. It is Mahayana Buddhism that uses tantric means. And so in that respect, Buddhism in general is not a tradition that's ever meant to be cultural glue primarily. It's not primarily there as a tribal tradition the way that Judaism is, and that's not a hierarchical statement. I'm not saying one's better than the other. If you look at the history, there's basically two kinds of traditions. There's the kind that's founded by a great, founder like Buddhism, like Christianity, and you could say like Islam, that have, a founder, and therefore they're very systematized because they're based on the life of that person and their teachings. And, then there's a dialectic through time that alters that or writes commentaries on it. And then there are things that are basically not that have their roots in the life of a whole society, like Judaism, like the Vedic traditions, which are, I don't use the word Hinduism. That's, kind of, as you likely know, that historically that's, a Persian word that the Brits kind of took on. There's no such thing as the Hindu tradition. There's the Vedic traditions, plural, many streams, 6, 7 major streams within the Vedic things, of which Buddhism is one kind of dimension of one of them, sort of thing, from their standpoint. Like historically, like if you look at what the Rig Veda, 4,500 BC, Rig meaning fire or desire, you could say thirst, Rig. Anyway, the point is that, I don't see it as an issue of doctrine, to get back to your question. It is not an issue of doctrine for me. It is not about no self. Sure, you can intellectually look at postmodernism and, Buddha Dharma. Many, many people have done that. And of course, postmodernism, the best of it, and I do actually disagree with Peterson on this. I think Foucault was a wonderful thinker. I respect him quite a lot.
It's this idea of deconstructing the self, yes, right? And that seems to be very Buddhistic.
No, it absolutely is.
Whereas his whole thrust is about constructing, the individual.
Well,
on the other hand, maybe there are two sides of the same coin.
That's right. But the answer again is sociological, and I was getting to that. Like, I think what he might say to answer your question, based on, say, his knowledge of Buddhism, and I share with him this basic sort of view because it's a sociological and practical question. Meaning, in any given community of people, it's important that some of the people in that community, whether it's a tribe of 100 or a civilization of 1 million or 1 billion, that some people within that community hold the space of being the shamanic, mystic visionaries that hold the highest view and maybe write commentaries about it and use yogic technologies to experience and become sort of evolved into dimensions of consciousness that are incredibly high. That's wonderful. But that is never meant to be in a cultural, in a kind of like in the numbers street sense, whether now or 6,000 years ago, was never meant to be huge numbers of people on the scale of modern societies like that. And, and I know there's people that are like, well, this is the Kali Yuga and this is the age of, the age of Aquarius is a kind of new agey expression of it.
Well, there's the exoteric tradition.
Exactly.
The popular tradition. And then there's
precisely
the inner traditions, which are often opposed to the.
Yes, that's right. It was a dialectic. That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
And there's a tension between that, you know.
And I think Jung here, before, you know, you had stopped me before, but Jung here is an interesting example in that respect, in that specific respect, because his project, I think, was trying to unite the esoteric and the exoteric, and also in uniting this objective stream, like I say, objective in the Karl Popper sense of like verifiable different communities of experimenters and kind of scientific visionaries testing each other's hypotheses, which again is the way that I view the history of the philosophy of science, you know, in the way that Nietzsche would have viewed it, probably, you know, certainly Hegel would have, and Kant, you know, like you can verify things in certain ways that are through the five senses that everybody can agree on. Okay, there's that thread in Western society, in Western civilization, because it's about exploration and verification and the sort of excitement of understanding and explore. You know, it's not engineering exactly, but it's very connected engineering. And then there's the other side, which is the religious, the awe, the subjective side. Like, what is it to experience being, capital B? You know, that is a profound question that the Greeks were definitely wrestling with, and that the sort of post-Enlightenment, you know, Kant, Hegel, you know, I would say the inheritors of that stream are, you know, Marx to a certain degree, but also basically Nietzsche was a sort of a radicalization of Hegel. And then Jung and Heidegger were the two great, from my perspective, the two great inheritors of that stream. And Peterson rightly, I think, puts Jung at the heart of what was most important about what happened most importantly in Western civilization in mid-century. You know, you could say Jung was born in 1875 and passed in 61. But, you know, it was, to me, it's the sociological question. There's esoteric and exoteric, and how does that work through time, through communities? How do communities of language and meaning develop themselves, respond to adaptive situations that they find themselves in? It's not really, and in that sense, his emphasis on the individual, I think, on its own terms, is somewhat, I wouldn't say disingenuous, because I don't want to ascribe that kind of nefarious motive to him. It's not, it's just intellectually a little bit incongruous, because he pretends, and this is my main critique of him, there's several smaller ones, but my main critique of him as an admirer of the general corpus of his work and how he presents himself, how he looks at being a clinician. I myself have thought of being a clinician. I have many, many close friends that are. My partner is currently working on a PhD in a kind of depth psychology field, and, you know, as I've mentioned to you. And so he, you know, like, I definitely, as an admirer, would like to say to him, like, look, your answer is the Protestant rationalist Christian answer. And there have been others in the West. They have not been small threads in the West. You know, the Counter-Reformation was a huge answer that tried to get back to a kind of Greek view of education and community. The other saner wings of the Protestant, Zwingli, the Swiss Reform wing, which is actually Jung's family lineage, which is why Jung, I think, is such a moderate, sort of grounded person with this, you know, this incredible, he came up with tantric alchemy, basically, you know, in a village setting. I mean, tantra is a very, what I'm calling, you know, tantra in the classical sense, is a very community-oriented type of spirituality that looks at ordinary life in much the way that Judaism and, you know, kind of the mystical aspects of Judaism. It's like, you don't have to all get it. You don't have to be at the table. Like, literally, there can be a rabbi that's literally been studying and reading and meditating and, you know, mysticizing his whole life, could be next to some dude that's like, you know, the candle maker, and they're going to like sing the songs. You know, that's the kind of thing that I think Jung would have found incredibly familiar and admirable. And that's definitely, you know, as you know, the world that you and I train in, I would say, is very much, there's a term, you know, they call it village tantra. That's, you know, scholars talk about that and try to reconstruct what that might have been in India, how the Tibetans do it differently, how the Chinese and Japanese esoteric stuff does it yet differently, and all this. But it's a very grounded kind of communal experience. And that's my critique of Jordan Peterson in a nutshell.
That he's missing this idea of communal practice. Is that what?
Well, that he's missing the degree, he's misemphasizing the degree to which the development and adaptation of truth is communal. And he does it for a reason, because he started with a very radical project that I think is somewhat misses the mark. It's, how do you avoid a totalitarian playing? Like, this is what he says, like, he became obsessed from age 15 or 16 with, you know, trying to decode the Cold War and Hitler and what had happened, and from a kind of leftist perspective. Actually, he was, connected to the Socialist Party, or to the Labor Party, I think, in Canada in the early days, and he was
the NDP,
and he was, and from that standpoint, I think that question is too radical a question to base mass spirituality on. Tibetans are extremely resilient, extremely individuated in a certain like mountain culture sense. That's something that people used to say to me, and I never really understood it until maybe the last 5-6 years. Like,
they're tough as hell, that's for sure.
They're tough, and especially
they have an incredible sense of humor. They're just always
absolutely, and
always
they're very
fooling around and laughing, and
absolutely,
they're not the least bit like this sort of refined. They're very, very tough.
They're very visceral. They're very visceral in a certain degree. One of the lamas, Lama Lena, who I don't mind mentioning, she's a Western teacher who is very much in a empowered, and she is the main lineage holder of her teacher. She teaches in a Nyingma sort of Dzogchen sort of tradition, and Drukpa Kaju, and she always says, they're mountain people. If you aren't practical and grounded by the time you're 13 or 14 years old in any real mountain culture, you may not survive, and so that kind of gritty practicality is assumed, in the sort of street wisdom of the tradition. And so when people talk about collectivist versus individualist, it's too, like in Peterson's terms, it's too low resolution of view of how esoteric traditions work. Like the esoteric traditions are adaptations, just like the exoteric traditions are adaptations. So exoteric Islam is an adaptation to what happened in the Middle East in certain ways. Esoteric Islam is an adaptation to what happened to those mystics and the places that they were. And by the way, as you may know, there's a very strong synergy between those mystics and the Kabbalists. The Islamic mystics were the Sufis, the people that came to be called the Sufis, were definitely interacting with the Vedic mystics and the tantric yogis in Kashmir and Afghanistan and these places. And they later influenced very strongly the development of Jewish mysticism because they were in similar places. And, this is what really woke me up to Jung again on behalf. And this is something, Dr. Peterson, if you ever hear this, like Dr. Peterson, I want to thank you for making me aware of the fact that when Jung taught his course on Nietzsche, he had 1,600 pages of handwritten notes. And that to me is like, okay, now this is a person that understands and understood the crisis of modernity to its very depths and was really trying to address his life's work to that. And then when I became aware of that, it kind of, again, I would say in a certain way, I don't think I got it quite so deeply in university. And thanks to my current partner, Kimberly Christensen, who's a lifelong, since she was 19, of sorts, a kind of Jungian from that time, and a mystic and a dreamer. She's working on a PhD right now on depth psychology related stuff and community dreaming and the reclamation of the dream from the kind of Protestant rationalist thing, historical. It's kind of almost like a post-colonial reclamation of dreaming, kind of thing. And through interacting with her over the last 8-9 years, and also from this thing with Peterson, I've become really appreciative, as I said, of Jung being a person that is truly on the level of like Heidegger in terms of his like embrace of the crisis of modernity in its fullest spectrum, in its fullest deep spectrum, and responding. Whether you like his response or not, the fact that, he is a response to the crisis of modernity in the most profound terms is already something. I mean, there's not many people that could say that, really. I mean, there's a few academic, people out there that like I really think that, like Jung and Heidegger.
Yeah, those are, I love Heidegger as well. Yeah.
Yeah, they're the two respondents, the founders of Asukia, this thing in Dharamsala. It's called Asukia. It's a Greek word, actually. It's a kind of an academy of former Shedra Tibetans. It's all Tibetan immersive. One of the founders, we were talking in Dharamsala one time, and he said to me, look, if you were going to translate Goethe into French, like imagine the level of German that you'd have to have, like just like colloquial German. Like nobody would sit there and hey, learn classical German and become a translator. The point is that this whole thing is just now, like I would say after 50 years of Buddhism, 50, 60 years of let's date it at 1960, being generous to the early generation and Mizumi Roshi and the kind of folk, Joshu Roshi and those kind of folks. Let's date it at 1960 when the Tibetans left and when the Japanese when the Westerners in America started to take an interest, and in Europe and a few other places. That's 70 years, 40 plus roughly 20. Say we're at 2020. So roughly speaking, it's 60 years, right? Do I have the math right? Did I mess it up again? No, 60 years. Yeah. So 60 years is 3 generations. Really, it's 2 generations, culturally speaking, kind of. So we're really at the beginning of the encounter of this 2 great civilizations, and this gets back to Jung and to Peterson. I mean, Jung died in 1961. I find that very interesting. He basically tried to express what the Vedic / Indo-Tibetan traditions were doing. He wrote a book called Kundalini. He wrote, he was seeing visions of mandalas. He was using the term capital S self in a somewhat different way, but he was basically trying to express what the great Indian and Indo-Tibetan and Chinese alchemical traditions were trying to express for practitioners, but in Western terms. So he used medieval alchemy. He used what he had, which is the Greek, the great Western stuff. That, and because he had that education as a son of a Swiss Reformed pastor who was born in 1875. He had that kind of classical education, and so the encounter. And he passed basically. He died in 61. And there is still renegade threads of depth psychology that are trying to pick up where he left off, like the Process Work Institute in Portland, I would say, which I'm somewhat slightly connected to, is trying to take it in and do the rest of the work that Jung may have done in this kind of shamanic cultural sort of realm that Tantra really rests in, I would say, like Arnold Mindell, and I'm more familiar with a gentleman named Gary Reese, who happens to be connected to my partner, Kim Christensen. And he, these folks are really, and, this isn't just my opinion. This isn't just some small community. These folks are really, will tell you, we're trying to do what Jung may have done had he lived longer. But ironically, had he lived longer, the Western world may never have gotten what Jung actually gave us, which was, like I said earlier, a synthesis of 2 impetuses within the human heart. One is this, I would say, uniquely, the West really specializes in this impetus of exploration, of mapping, of how does this leaf turn into this other leaf? How does a bat evolve into that? Wow, let's figure it out and test each other's hypothesis and constructively bring out the truth for the collective. That is the empirical Western tradition, as I see it, the best of it, you could say, and this other stream, which is the subjective mythos, how do we experience reality and being? How do we actually experience it? What do our dreams say about our states, about our archetypal, the play of yin and yang in our psyches as primates and evolutionary psychology and all this? Many scholars and commentators have said, Jung's lifespan happening exactly when it did was, in a sense, a giant gift to all of us maybe in the future. Maybe it's that the Tibetans masters will start speaking, and there's many Tibetan teachers that are starting to express. Trungpa Rinpoche used the word logos when he spoke about different forms of data.
He talked about logos, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, in that way, he would say the 8 logoses of such and such a deity or of such and such a master. That is a profound understanding of Western civilization that we owe partly to Jung and to Jung's sort of incorporation of classical Greece, I would say, really, which is what the Counter-Reformation people were doing. And, that's no small matter, and I think Peterson, to get back to Peterson really has that right. I do believe that. And as I said, I think the part that he is misrepresenting through incompleteness by omission, I would say, for understandable reasons. And I've heard some of his reasons for this, but I think the part that he's sort of missing is that there were other responses other than this radically individualistic form of Protestant rationalist Christianity that he essentially represents. He uses this term collectivist, still, now, even in even in the podcasts with Sam Harris, I mean, he's talking about collectivism as the great evil, because objectively, the meta narratives have evolved to have the great hero and the God the Father. And, that is one version. That's the Protestant, rationalist version. But there's also the Counter-Reformation version. There's also the Swiss Reformed Zwingli version. There's also the Eastern Christian version, which is my family lineage, frankly. My mother and her side were non-Jewish Russians. And, I have an uncle in Moscow who's in his early 70s, who's a Christian mystic, like a full-on Christian mystic, still was in the Soviet era. And that mysticism, that Christianity is totally different. As I'm sure it's a totally different kind of thing than this kind of archetypal, patriarchal sort of you and your sin and you and your personal relation. It's not like that at all. It's a very different spirit, and it also has its shadow, of course, like everything in human realms will have, but it's a very different answer. And I think Peterson is somewhat intellectually and spiritually incongruous from my vantage on his own terms, by not including some of the other great traditions that the West evolved, some other different flavors of a Brahmic spirituality that arose, and were alive in the early 20th century and had their own answers to totalitarian, excesses of the left and the right, which is a very radical project. He starts with that. I mean, I think his question is too radical for the masses. I really, and I'm not saying that in a condescending way. I think that it's so extreme, like his mission.
I'm losing you a little bit. His question is too radical. What do you mean? Which question?
Well, the question, like what he says, like when he speaks now, and this is, I'm talking about, 2 days ago or whenever I heard one of the Sam Harris, things that was finally published, a little bit later and stuff. And, and he still speaks of, when he speaks about his own history, when he goes out on stage and speaks in, Dublin or wherever he's speaking, he'll say, look, when I was 15, I became obsessed with, the Cold War and the excesses of the early 20th century, the brutal horrors, the totalitarian, the big killing machine of the rise of Hitler and the rise of Stalin, and then later Mao and the great, like the East Asian sort of, mad, collectivist projects and this, like that's what he talks about, and that's a beautiful thing. Like I really sympathize with that. My father, we left the Soviet Union, and in that way, in a certain sense, you could say. My parents weren't dissidents per se, but they were certainly aware of the issues, which is why they took a huge risk and left. But the point is, his question is, he says, when I was 15, I became obsessed with the question of how does one, this kind of ethical, moral question, how does one avoid being the prison guard at Auschwitz or being the Stalinist, henchman or whatever, like the guy that goes to kill Trotsky or whatever, like that sort of thing. Like that's what
I'm not sure that's his question. I think
it is absolutely his question.
His question is more like, I know that I am that person, right?
Well, it is, but that's part of the answer. Yeah. That's part of the answer.
Which is like going and seeing your the having a vision of hell in a sense.
That's right. But that's part of the answer, I would say. That's how he speaks about it. What he says in terms of his own history, like what happened to him when he was a young man and wrote maps of meaning in his 20s mostly and that sort of thing. What he says is that I became obsessed with this very particular question of how does one fortify one's own heart against the seduction of what Jung would have called demonic, ideological demonic possession. I think Jung actually did use that term. I may be wrong about that, but I know later depth psychology people, especially ones related with addiction, would talk about, ideological possession or demonic possession, So he was saying, how do you avoid, and I would say, look, that's...
So how do you avoid it? What's your answer?
Well, I would give the answer of the Hegelians, and I would say, like, I'm thinking at the moment of Rabbi Michael Lerner, who is in the Bay Area still, I believe he lives in Berkeley, and he spoke at Muhammad Ali's funeral, and he is a visionary, he's a very quirky person. A lot of people like him and don't like him. I was around him for a couple of years in the late 90s and still, see him from time to time, and he's a lovely, thinker and leader and spiritually very lovely person in my experience. And he is, his answer is basically not Peterson's answer. It's a Jewish answer and not a Calvinist Protestant answer, basically, I would say, in terms of culture and intellectual style and sort of moral, the style.
So what's the difference? What's the different answer?
Well, it's Buber. Do you know who Martin Buber was? I'm sure you do, right?
I endow, yeah.
Yes, Buber.
So it's
Buber,
relationship instead of individuality. That's what you're saying.
It's collective redemption versus individual redemption. Yeah. And that is what, those are very, very powerful streams that are extant in the West that Peterson largely ignores when he does his shtick, not ignores, but he's aware of them. I'm not trying to, ascribe nefarious motives to Peterson because he's trying to push a certain flavor of it. But I think that he has reasons why he does that, and he admits, yes, I'm very influenced by this kind of Scottish sort of thing because that's where I come from. Like, he said things like that, and I respect him for that. But the point is that I think intellectually and morally and ethically, spiritually, you could say, theologically, it's incumbent upon someone that's speaking with the kind of pulpit that Jordan Peterson currently has to at least give a nod to the other great responses that have come from within the West that are substantial. The Jewish responses, the Counter-Reformation responses, the Eastern Christian responses that also have a very strong answer, and it's collective in some. It's a different. I wouldn't say it's collective redemption actually, but I'll take that back.
Collective is an ugly word, right?
No, it's not an ugly word.
Community is not an ugly word, but collective.
No, collective is not an ugly word either. It doesn't need to be. It's been uglyified by. Well,
it's a word that's been uglified. Then it feels ugly to me.
Yeah, it's an uglified word that I think it's sad. I think we frankly, I was not raised in that Anglosphere. I was raised in the Northeast, as we were talking about earlier. I was raised in South Jersey. I was raised in a context where people, it doesn't matter your ethnicity. I mean, you can today, if you, walk into, the Philadelphia area and you're in a deli and someone starts talking about the news or, some joke about, how he loves his wife, but he's a little tired of her, so he has to be in the deli or something. Like, people will break in and talk. It's a village culture. But the fact that Solzhenitsyn, if you look at, so he wrote the Gulag Archipelago and the First Circle and all these incredible sort of exposés on the disgusting, brutal, horrific excesses of the Soviet system. But what did he do in the 90s, man? Like, he was talking about our children and he was talking about essentially education. Like, how do we rebuild a Slavic Christian civilization, a Christian in the positive sense of good values and good, and that's what there's videos of him on YouTube talking about it, man. I think it's from the 80s. Maybe it's from the from the 90s and late 80s, 90s. He started to become somewhat of a public figure in kind of commenting on those kinds of things. He wasn't saying, go be this great individual and fortify yourself. And that's a very Protestant view of reality, and a Calvinist one specifically. Like Zwingli, who was in the 1500s, was Calvin's great sort of nemesis in Switzerland. John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli were the two Swiss, and the Swiss Reformed Church, frankly, is so sensible that it has changed very little in 500 years, I would say. I know there's a bunch of Swiss Reform people that might say, no, we've changed a lot. But relatively speaking, there aren't all these offshoot movements of Swiss Reform the way that there are in the one name you do not hear very much, at least. I haven't heard it much at all, even though I've listened to hundreds of hours of Peterson. I haven't heard him mention Hegel. And Hegel is one of the great streams. I personally think of Nietzsche. He mentions Nietzsche correctly, as a great figure. But Nietzsche, in my view, and I'm totally stealing from Robert Pippin and some of his sources, in terms of my take on Nietzsche, is Nietzsche is a radicalization of Hegel. I mean, Hegel mapped the core ways that the life of the archetypal hero or heroine works in the village, and the power of logos and notions and ideas, and how people need reciprocity and to be seen, and that all came from Hegel, and he doesn't talk about Hegel. There's a reason why they say there's a left-wing Hegelianism and there's a right-wing Hegelianism, and there's because Hegel is really the great, and he doesn't really, Peterson doesn't really represent accurately the sort of spectrum of responses to the crisis of modernity, good responses, living, breathing responses that are out there in large numbers, influencing political systems, influencing the Europeans. He uses this term collectivism. He tosses it around like some sort of like some libertarian sort of thing because he's trying not to alienate the people on the right or whatever. But it's that I think is a little bit disingenuous, because the term collectivist, the way that he's using it, I think is actually quite disgusting, not disgusting, I mean intellectually. I'm not saying this politically because he's aligned with the right. Please don't anyone misunderstand that. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying it's a little bit disingenuous, and therefore you could say disgusting, on an intellectual level, on its own terms. And
maybe he's just not giving people what they want to hear. Because a lot of like if you're a church going Christian, right?
Yeah.
And you're into Peterson, you're like, Peterson's great, but he doesn't go to church,
Right.
He doesn't practice, so he's a heretic, at the same time. And then people who are more on the Sam Harris side,
right,
of thing, like, oh, he's a great thinker, but he's into this Jungian, mysticism.
Yeah, no, I don't envy the guy.
I think everyone can find a sort of
right,
missing
Rorschach. Yeah, it's a Rorschach test. Yeah, exactly. And he knows that when we talk about the separation of the masculine and feminine, because of course Vajrayana Buddhism as an esoteric tradition is an alchemical form of spirituality. It's very interested in the masculine and the feminine within a human being and how that manifests for that individual and for communities and in the world and in the cosmos, you could say. And so all those things are very familiar, to both of us being trained in those traditions. But there's, like he was saying, that there isn't really a kind of separation. Like these things were never meant to be separated in the way that I think some of the mid-century scholarship tried to say they were. All right, brother.
Okay, my friend. Good night.
High five, fist bump, hug, namaste.
Yeah.
Tibetan tashi dele. May the road rise to meet you.
Yeah. And all that. Okay, cool.
All that.